You are listening to the Akkeri podcast, a show about men and masculinities, the challenges that modern men face, and how to chart a better way forward. I'm your host, Matt Howlett, mental health coach and founder of the Akkeri. This first episode is a story. It's my story, but it's also the story behind the Akkeri, because the Akkeri's origins are found in the biggest challenges of my life. My story is one of fatherlessness, the good and bad of religion, divorce, as well as a great deal of trying, failing, and learning. And since you, dear listener, likely don't know much about this person whose voice is now in your ears, this story will also introduce you to me, Matt Howlett, and that just feels like the right place to start. Now, just a couple of quick points before we jump in. First, the Akkeri podcast is focused on bringing the conversation around men and masculinities to the forefront. We are also creating practical solutions for challenges that men face in the areas of mental health and personal development. And yes, Akkeri is not an English word. It's an Old Norse word meaning anchor. Second, this story is very personal, but it's not long. I'm going to give you the 10,000-foot view with a few select stories, but that should give you a sense of who I am and why I became a coach and created the Akkeri. So let's dive in. I grew up as the firstborn son to a single mother. My parents divorced when I was young, so I spent the majority of my childhood with my mother and my grandmother. Now, my father was in the picture. My sister and I were dropped off at his house every Saturday for over a decade, but I never had a close relationship with him. He taught me a lot of practical things like how to ski, how to fish, how to operate a quad, how to snare rabbits, but I never felt like I was being shown how to be a man. In fact, a lot of the negative mindsets that I had to work on in therapy came directly from my father. Now, in his defense, he came from a big family, and I don't think he had much of a relationship with his father either. He also didn't have much education, and the majority of his life was spent doing labor jobs to make ends meet. The sad reality is that my father showed me a lot of what I did not want to become. When he passed from cancer, his last words to me was that life was short. The sadness in his voice was palpable, and I wished his experience and our relationship had been different. But the few times that I tried to have a more serious personal conversation with him, he always avoided them. Now, my father's family is Catholic, but like I said, I grew up with my mother, and the majority of her family are Protestant, so I grew up attending a Pentecostal church that was just a few minutes walk away from my childhood home. I went to church twice on Sundays, attended summer Bible camps, and eventually joined the church's youth group, which meant I was going to church on Saturday evenings as well. And for at least a few of my childhood years, I also attended a midweek program, and it was called, get this, Crusaders. If you think that's a lot of church, you are correct, but there's more. Newfoundland had a denominational school system in place up until the year that I graduated, so yeah, that means I went to a Christian school as well. Now, I didn't realize how deeply entrenched I was in the Christian church because I didn't have any external influences that would cause me to question it. And that wasn't by choice. We weren't allowed to listen to non-Christian or non-church music, at least not until I was well into my teenage years. Most popular television shows were off limits, and we certainly weren't allowed to play with cards. My sister and I had a pack taken away from us when we were kids. I don't remember where we got them or why, but I suppose playing cards was too closely related to gambling, and that one was a definite no-no. There was a long list of do's and don'ts back then, and a lot of them didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, especially the whole dress up to go to church thing. But that is the context that I grew up in. Now, don't get me wrong. There's a lot about my upbringing that I'm grateful for, but there's also a lot about it that wasn't helpful or even healthy. But that is a different conversation for a different time. So what did the overchurched young man do after finishing grade 12 at his Christian high school? Well, he did more church things, of course. I had no idea what I wanted to do after high school. I remember presenting this problem to the school's guidance counselor, and he gave me an aptitude test. Now, guidance counselors, if you are listening, or really anybody that works with adolescents, the best way to help someone know what they want to do is to get to know them, and help them get to know themselves. I get that this was the 90s, and aptitude tests may have been the best weapon for the guidance counselor at this point in time, but seriously, when you're forcing young minds through the standard high school curriculum without equipping them with the basic emotional intelligence needed to make big decisions like that, It feels like a bit of a dick move, but hey, that's just me. It was the 90s. Now back to the story and the church things. All that I knew after high school was that I loved music. I was playing and singing in church bands at that point, and I knew that I generally enjoyed volunteering in church leadership roles as well. But my favorite aspect of all of it was being a worship leader, specifically working with musicians who took their faith and their musicianship seriously. For anybody that's not familiar with the whole church world, a worship leader is someone who leads the band in church. And the Pentecostal denomination traditionally has a band that more closely resembles a rock group rather than just the organ that you would see in most Catholic churches. So there's like a keyboard, drums, electric guitar, acoustic guitar, a couple of singers, just a bigger group. So after high school, I took 3 online courses from a Bible college kind of as a trial run. Those 3 courses felt okay, so I decided to make the leap. I moved to Alberta and enrolled in a theology and music program at a private Bible college. I still didn't really know what I wanted to do with my life, but one of the tenets of Christianity is that God has a plan for your life, and He'll help you figure out the best path if you just trust Him. So that's what I thought I was doing. And for the most part, things went well for me for a while. In college, I had a lot of opportunities to play and lead. I made a lot of friends there, got to travel a fair bit. I eventually graduated with honors and decided to move back to Newfoundland because that's what felt right to me at the time. I didn't hear a voice. I didn't see a sign. It just felt like the right thing to do. I also didn't love Edmonton. And apologies to my Albertan friends. The River Valley was great, but I honestly think Newfoundlanders have some type of like innate desire to be near the ocean. Within 2 months of being back in Newfoundland, I had found a well-paying job as a youth care worker, and I was offered a role within a new church that was just starting up. I've often referred to those next 3 years as the best 3 years of my life. I was involved in a project that I really believed in. I had responsibilities that I excelled with. I had a group of friends that were a mix of old and new. I bought my first home. It seemed like everything was working as it should, or as God intended. And that's what I believed at the time. That was 2005 to 2008. Things started to really change for me after that. In the fall of 2008, I left the church plant and took a role at a bigger, more established, slightly more traditional church. I also got engaged that year and married the next. Both of those decisions seemed like the right ones at the time, but they were not. I had serious feelings of doubt around the engagement, which I did bring up to my fiancée at the time, but her response to my uncertainty pushed me to doubt my doubts, and my faith definitely played a role as well, because what kind of Christian leader, or just Christian in general, would get engaged but then change their mind? So I ignored those thoughts and those feelings and just moved forward. I also had feelings of doubt with the new role at the bigger church. Somewhere close to the 2-year mark, I started to realize that the culture of the church was just not what I had assumed. I think I was fairly idealistic at the time and maybe slightly naive, but I believed that Christians wanted to be more like Jesus in their day-to-day lives. And so the desire for personal growth, humility, and an openness to accountability would be assumed. I quickly learned this was just not the case, and I could have easily left that position. But I didn't want to be the pastor who had barely been around long enough to get to know people before leaving. But I ignored those thoughts and feelings too, and I kept going. But I'd soon be forced to realize that the role in that church was just not a right fit for me. To keep it simple, there were several conflicts with people who held a certain amount of political power within the church. They disagreed with decisions I had made or simply did not like me or the way that I led, and they made that known, either through an angrily worded email, because why have a civilized face-to-face conversation with someone when you disagree with them? Or they went over my head and talked to the lead pastor, who's essentially my boss. At one point, the conflicts were blamed on my apparent lack of self-awareness, which my psychologist confirmed was laughable, which is good because I laughed. And shortly after that, I was told it was time for me to move on. In other words, resign and act like it was of my own choosing. That was the beginning of my departure from organized religion. Although I tried to be part of a Christian church after that, and I even volunteered again, I just couldn't reconcile what I had experienced with what I believed to be true about the life and teachings of Jesus. I saw far too many conflicts between what Christians say they believe and how they actually live, and integrity is a really big deal to me. Now, I am not even trying to infer that I was the perfect model of Christianity or that every decision I made as a pastor was the right one. But I do know that I always tried to respect people even when we didn't agree, and I approached those conversations with the belief that although I was one of their leaders, we were on the same team trying to grow and help people together. But over the years, I've learned that no matter how hard you try, there will always be people that you will never see eye to eye with, and that's sad, but that's okay. That was the last time I worked as a pastor. And in 2013, I moved with my wife at the time to Vancouver so I could study digital media and likely change careers. That move initiated a big reorientation process for me around what I believed and what I wanted to do in life. And processing those struggles and finding answers to all the questions I had would have likely been easier for me to manage if that was the only thing that was going on at the time, but it wasn't. I was enjoying the media program and had met friends there, but towards the end of that first year in Vancouver, I learned that my wife had been in a relationship with another woman. This was a huge shock for me, and not simply because my trust had been broken, but also because it made me realize that I didn't really know the woman that I'd married. The years that followed were the hardest years of my life. I left Vancouver and spent the next 2 years living in 3 different places, basically doing the best that I could to process all that I'd been through and find some sense of normalcy. I didn't want to be divorced. I believed that we could reconcile and be happy, but those beliefs were naive and blindly driven by my faith. We had dated long distance, and when we finally lived together after marrying, the relationship changed. We both had unrealistic expectations, and we were simply very different people. But I didn't see that at the time. All I saw was my faith, the belief that God hated divorce and very much wanted to bring us back together. And I felt like I needed to be an example of understanding, patience, and forgiveness. So despite asking my psychologist for advice and hearing that divorce was likely my best option, I chose to ignore that advice and hope for reconciliation. Now, we eventually did get back together, but it was short-lived. After 1 year of living together, I sold a lot of what I had owned and moved to Southeast Asia. I needed to do something completely different, so I decided to teach English and travel. I went from Thailand to southern Vietnam, eventually settling in a northern Vietnam city called Ha Long. I was dealing with a lot of thoughts and feelings throughout that time, so the random challenges I experienced there always felt harder, but I enjoyed and very much needed that experience of being in a completely different context. I fell in love with motorbikes and a Vietnamese dish called bún chả. I met friendly, inquisitive, and kind people who weren't bothered by the language barrier or my poor attempts at speaking their language. I was reminded of how much I loved working with teenagers and how satisfying it was to earn their trust and be welcomed as more than just a teacher. And I was reminded that the world is so much bigger than the very sheltered religious world that I grew up in. And I had no plan or intention of coming back until my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer at just 56 years old. I got the news through a FaceTime call with mom and my 3 siblings. When I saw them all on the screen, I knew something was up, but I didn't expect to hear that I would likely lose my mother within the year. At the time of the call, mom was positive and seemingly okay. There was clearly some hope that she would recover, and there was mention of some unconventional treatment in the works. She knew I had plans to go to Cambodia for Chinese New Year, and she wanted me to do that, so I did. But in the months that followed, her condition quickly deteriorated, and I flew home about 2 weeks before she passed. I was very grateful to have that time with her, but no amount of time could have prepared me for that loss. I was her firstborn, and she was my only true parent. Without mom, the home I grew up in was totally different. The family wasn't the same, and Newfoundland did not feel like home anymore. I spent a couple of months after the funeral in Newfoundland, but eventually I moved to Canmore, Alberta to work with a friend of mine on an agricultural technology startup. If you aren't familiar with Canmore, it's an old mining town that became a popular tourist destination after the Nordic events from the 1988 Winter Olympics were hosted there. I bought a motorcycle and explored the parks and mountain roads as often as possible. I hiked as many of the trails as I could, and I filled my camera with shots of mountains, valleys, and elk. Lots and lots of elk. The startup was a great learning experience. We had designed and built a hydroponic system that was innovative and promising, but when a planned investment of around $400K was rescinded, things quickly went south. As we were basically at the end of our runway, we simply didn't have the time to secure an investment big enough to get us to production. It was the beginning of the end, but I don't think any of us really wanted to acknowledge it at the time. And this was the second failed startup that I'd been a part of. It was difficult to accept as I had high hopes for that project, but I had applied to grad school in Victoria at that point as well, so I accepted that ending as a natural transition and planned my move back to BC. Now, that was the end of 2019. So yes, you guessed it, I arrived on Vancouver Island just as the COVID lockdowns were starting. Shitty timing, I know, but there was no way to see that one coming. So from 2019 to 2021, I studied communications and researched the need for belonging among young men while living mainly in isolation. Ironic, since I was studying a human need that fundamentally requires in-person interactions. Needless to say, that was tough. I did eventually finish the thesis, but there were several moments when I just wanted to hit the fuck it button and throw my laptop off my 21st floor balcony. Apparently, that's a common desire among grad students. In the end, I'm very glad to have experienced grad school outside of a theological context. Now, if you've been following the dates here, you'll know that we're just about caught up to today as this episode is being released in spring of 24. I've obviously left out a lot of details, and there are a million of other storylines that I could have shared, but these have been the defining ones. And if you've noticed, the majority of them have been stories of hardship. The fatherlessness, interpersonal conflict, changing worldviews, the adultery, death of a parent, failed business ventures. For a solid decade, it felt like I was getting hit with one tough situation after another. There were a lot of positive experiences mixed in there, but I've shared the more challenging ones with you because they were the defining moments. I believe that who we are and what we're becoming is primarily shaped by our experiences, but it's the hard ones, the hard times that refine us the most and give us the biggest opportunities for learning. So now to the main question, why have I shared these stories with you? As I mentioned at the outset, I thought it'd be fitting to have this first episode of the podcast as an introduction, not just to me, but to what the Akkeri is and why it exists. The Akkeri began as an idea on a whiteboard at the co-working space that became my second home while living in Canmore, Alberta. When the startup started to show signs of failure, I felt the need to spend some time dreaming about what I could do next. I wanted to do something that was more about people than a product. It had to be creative and it had to be mine. I did not want to follow someone else's lead anymore. So I spent time writing about what I had enjoyed doing over the years and digging into the reasons why I had become a pastor in the first place. I loved people. I'm definitely introverted and I need time alone and I don't like everybody, but I do love everybody. I love people and I always found deep satisfaction in helping people, especially men. My experiences had given me a rich understanding of the unique challenges that men face, and I knew I could do something to help. I wanted to share what I'd learned and continue to learn through my own personal work, research, and experience. So that's why the Akkeri exists. The Akkeri is a growing educational media and coaching company focused on men's mental health and well-being. And this medium of podcasting allows us to dig into specific conversations to support that. Conversations with mental health experts, like the one with my own psychologist about his upcoming book entitled Balls: How Men Find Courage with Words, Work, Wine, and Women. Love that title. And in conversations with everyday men, like the one with my friend who grew up in church as I did, but eventually walked away from it and now lives happily as an atheist. And many, many more. Why? Because us men need to be reminded that vulnerability is strength, not weakness, and that willingness to open up and be vulnerable is a requirement for personal growth, and it opens the door to a richer, more satisfying life. Thank you for listening. I hope you found some value in this episode. If you have, be sure to share the Akkeri podcast with a friend and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can find the Akkeri on socials at The Akkeri and on the web at theakkeri.com.